Do you believe in our founders' vision for America? That our republic will only survive if we are an educated and informed people who know our rights and duties. Since 1844, Hillsdale College has sought to educate all who wish to learn about these timeless principles of self-government. For more than 50 years, the college has worked to spread that mission by sending Imprimis to millions of Americans. Imprimis features some of the best speeches given at Hillsdale events, and now an audio version of the popular Speech Digest is available in a new podcast of the same name. And, like the print publication, Imprimis, the podcast, is always free. Listen to the best arguments from speakers such as Chris Rufo, Molly Hemingway, Mark Stein, and Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, read by Hillsdale students. Subscribe today to listen to Imprimis at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined today by Lawton Hawkins. He is a Latin teacher at Atlanta Classical Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. Lawton, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Take a moment here as we begin and tell us a little about Atlanta Classical and tell our listeners what you do at Atlanta Classical.
Sure. Atlanta Classical is now in its 10th year in Atlanta. It's a member of the Barney Charter School Initiative and the Hillsdale K-12 Initiative, and it aims to provide a content-rich curriculum to students and to mold intelligent, virtuous citizens, like I think many of the classical schools in the network attempt to achieve. I teach Latin there, though I also teach a number of other things. I have a graduate degree in history, so sometimes I'm called upon to teach history. I was a lawyer for about 20 years, so sometimes I'm corralled to teach a government class or a political philosophy class. I have an undergraduate degree in English, so I teach some literature classes, and then right now I'm also teaching a logic class. But the bulk of what I do is Latin.
You allude to this a little in that answer, but your route to classical education was a bit of a winding one. Give us a little background about where you came from before reaching education and how that career went forward.
Sure. After I graduated from college back in the 1980s, you may remember from that time Japan was going to take over the world. And so it seems like I may have backed the wrong horse in that regard, but I had a wonderful experience because I went over to Japan to teach English. And I got very interested in the Japanese language. And then I went to graduate school in Japanese and then spent some time working for a Japanese newspaper before applying to law school. And then after practicing law for a couple of years, I went back to Japan to study Japanese law. And I remained over there for about a decade, working first for a U.S. law firm and then for American Express as their Japan counsel. So I spent a lot of time there. I also spent a little bit of time in Singapore. And then after a short stint teaching law school, I came back to Atlanta, my hometown, and worked for the Coca-Cola company. But I always really wanted to teach. I had done some teaching of law while I'd been in Japan also. I really didn't know how I was going to do that. I was advised by someone I trust that I should probably get a different graduate degree in the field I wanted to teach because schools are somewhat skeptical of a middle-aged man who wants to retire to the bowers of academia. And if you don't show some kind of commitment, I'm really focused on history or whatever, they're not going to take you very seriously. So I got enrolled in the PhD program at Georgia State, our local university here in Atlanta, and had to relearn Latin as my second foreign language. I hadn't had Latin since had been in high school. I didn't even take it in college. And I got more and more interested in Latin, and then I applied as a history teacher a bunch of places. But the funny thing is, if you apply as a history teacher in America, the first question they want to ask you is not, could you explain the significance of the diet of worms, but can you coach lacrosse? That was what every private school was interested in, was a lacrosse coach.
Huh.
That's, I think, how they staffed their sports teams, was through the history department.
Yeah.
So I didn't get a single serious offer my first year around. The second year around, I still didn't get a job, but Atlanta Classical Academy said they actually had a place, a need for a Latin teacher. Well, I happened to I happened to read and write Latin. And so I was lucky enough to land a job here, and it's just been an amazing experience. It also meant that my son, who had applied in the lottery for Atlanta Classical Academy the previous year, moved up from 75th place in the line to first. So he walked in the front door with me. He was in second grade at the time, and he's in ninth grade now, and it's just been a fantastic experience, the best decision I ever made.
I guess the big question is, do you have to coach lacrosse at Atlanta Classical?
No, I don't have to coach lacrosse. We're too small to field a lacrosse team. Though coaching and other extracurriculars is encouraged and all that sort of thing, it's not the primary focus of the school. Though we've got a basketball team and a cross-country team and a soccer team and a number of other things, volleyball, et cetera.
Was classical education always a part of your thoughts about becoming a teacher? You said you always had it in the back of your mind that you might want to do it. Did you think that it was going to be in classical education?
No, but I will tell you, this was something I discovered when I went through the application process. I didn't give you enough detail for you to discern this, but one exception to the rule that all anyone was looking for was a lacrosse coach were the classical schools. That was really striking. I remember having several very engaging conversations on matters of some sort of historical interest with the representatives from a handful of classical schools. I'm not a practicing Christian. It turns out that the classical schools, where I had these wonderful conversations and where I saw a real affinity, were faith-based schools and would have required some sort of statement of faith as a condition to employment. And so, unfortunately, I wasn't able to teach at any of those schools. But that was the first inkling that I had. The classical schools were it's kind of a uniquely serious place intellectually compared to the run-of-the-mill private school. And I wasn't even looking at public schools because I don't have a teaching certificate, and that would disqualify me from teaching in public schools.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a bit about that transition from your job as a lawyer, practicing law, working for the Coca-Cola company, and look, being next to and being involved with adults all day long, or college students when you were teaching there, to being in a K-12 environment. How did you find that transition?
Well, I thought, naively, that while teaching in a K-12 environment would be different from teaching in a college or a law school, it would be fundamentally similar. And I expected that the closest analogy in my own life to teaching in a high school would have been my experience teaching in college or law school. I found in practice that the closest job I ever had to teaching at the secondary level was the job I had as a waiter at the Santa Fe Cafe in Northern Virginia many, many years ago. It's a job that requires you to be on your feet all the time. It's a very physically demanding job. And that was something I didn't really expect. Not that it's overwhelming or anything. It was just surprising. And it requires you to be very well organized, the way a good waiter is very well organized. And there's lots of things that you learn about teaching that have nothing to do with the oblative absolute, but more to do with, here's how you can make sure that students are paying attention. Here's how you can make sure that things run smoothly and that kids are on time and that they develop a love for the subject matter. Those are the sort of things which at, say, for example, the law school level, you already know going in. No one's going to be in law school without a sense of purpose. You don't have to provide that for them. Whereas in K through 12 education, you've got to help them see the value of what they're doing. It's a compulsory education system, and so not everyone is here for the love of learning. You have to help instill it in them and help them see the beauty of it. It's not a given.
Talking with Lawton Hawkins, who's a Latin teacher at Atlanta Classical Academy in Atlanta, Georgia, making that transition from the corporate world and the world of law to Atlanta Classical. We talk with people who have made these transitions, similar transitions, and speak to, or people listen who are thinking about making similar transitions. Once Atlanta Classical appeared on your radar screen and there was an investigation about potentially teaching there, what was required of you? What did you have to do to transition from your previous job to teaching at Atlanta Classical?
Well, by that time, most of the things that I had to do, I had already done. So I think it's very important to Atlanta Classical that the teachers be subject matter experts. And so in the course of doing my work, my history PhD work, I had taken lots and lots of Latin, and I had improved my Latin considerably from what it had been like when I studied all those many years ago. So from a content perspective, it was pretty much there.
When you are in the corporate world, working for a law firm, working for Coca-Cola, the wins are somewhat obvious. You might win a case, you might get a promotion. Once you enter the classroom at Atlanta Classical, how do you define success in your classroom?
What a good question. And that's changed. That's changed a little bit over a number of years. Well, the things that the real successes are when a child kind of makes a turn from someone who doesn't care about something and all of a sudden does care about something, or from a child who had this view about education and now has sort of a negative view of education, now has a positive view of education. So I've always felt that way. But my ambitions over time, now my 8th year, have become a little more tempered in this. Over time, I've begun to view my role more as that of a fisherman. I cast out the lines. You throw out a line, and you may not get anything. And you throw it out again, and you may not get anything. And you may have 10 students, and it may work with 2. It may work with 4. Heck, it may work with 8. You never really know, but you can't expect to catch every fish in the ocean. And you just try to continue to cast the nets. I mean, cast the lines or the nets or whatever, because even though you may not catch everything with wet tackle, you're not going to catch anything with dry tackle.
When you look at the culture at, say, Coca-Cola, and the culture at Atlanta Classical, we talk with teachers and administrators all the time about the importance of setting a culture at a classical school and keeping that culture through the years and how that takes place. Can you compare at all the success of Coca-Cola being one of the biggest brands in the world and the role that culture plays there to the role that the culture plays at Atlanta Classical Academy?
I would say you mentioned Coca-Cola having one of the best brands or the most famous brands in the world, and that's true. But if I were to compare the cultures of the two places, I would say the culture is much stronger at ACA than it is, Atlanta Classical Academy, than it is at the Coca-Cola Company. I think it's actually rather hard to maintain a consistent culture throughout the entire globe. Coca-Cola is in more countries than are represented in the United Nations. I think because Palestine and Taiwan don't have seats. I can't remember where else we are where we don't have seats in the United Nations. But it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. And it draws from people all over the planet and has been doing so for well over 100 years. And so it's difficult to maintain a consistency of culture in something that's sprawling. Atlanta Classical Academy has the virtue, I guess you'd say, it's both a virtue and a vice, I suppose, of localism. Things that are local, that are close to you personally, close to your children. Those are sort of organizations where culture can be maintained and fostered, and you don't have to perhaps compromise your culture quite as much. It also helps that the Atlanta Classical Academy is relatively new, and it has the benefits from the enthusiasm that comes from being part of an exciting new organization. And it hasn't gotten stale as old organizations can if the culture is not sufficiently cultivated. There is a natural tendency in the world towards entropy, and to counteract that requires large infusions of energy. And I think we have the energy and a sense of mission here that fortunately has not happened, and that we've been able to maintain our culture in a way that, to me, has been just been great.
You mentioned you have a student at Atlanta Classical Academy, and I'm wondering if you think that you give him more insight about learning, or he gives you more insight about teaching.
That's a terrific question. Well, I think I probably give him more insight about learning. I think because not only have I been teaching at this school with him for 8 years, we also have car rides to and from school where we talk about school a lot, and I try to provide context for things that he's learned or help him see connections between one subject matter and the other. So I think that probably prevails on the other hand.
Final question here for Lawton Hawkins, Latin teacher at Atlanta Classical Academy. For those who might be considering a move to classical education, to become part of a school as a teacher or as an administrator, what are those defining memories you have of your time at Atlanta Classical, and where have you found your rewards in working for a school like this?
Well, I'll give you one. There was a young lady I taught in Latin, 7th grade, 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, and 12th grade. I'm not the only Latin teacher at Atlanta Classical Academy, but it turns out that with this class, they were 7th grade when I joined, and I just continued to teach them all the way through that class. I just happened by coincidence to teach every year. I'm a fairly strict teacher. I'm not ashamed to say that. And there was a little bit of tension between her and me, and it also included tension between her mother and me. Her mother hearing her side of the story and thinking that I was too hard on this young lady and I was too demanding, etc. Anyway, fast forward her freshman year in college, and she had to take a Latin class. Anyway, I was at my computer about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and an email comes through in which she said, "Mr. Hawkins, I just want to thank you so much for everything that you did for me in Latin. I'm in a Latin class here. I'm the only freshman, and the seniors come to me with questions, and I've come to see how valuable this all is. I want to thank you for everything you've done." Well, it's a memory I'll take with me to the grave.
Lawton Hawkins, Latin teacher at Atlanta Classical Academy. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K12. Hillsdale_K12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.